The awakening of an empath rarely begins in a dramatic or obvious way. There is no sudden event that signals a transformation. Instead, it starts with a quiet, deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seems to repair. It feels like your entire system is worn down from something you cannot quite name, as if your inner world has been running without pause for years. For a long time, you move through life like a highly sensitive receiver, constantly picking up emotional frequencies from everyone around you. You enter a space and immediately sense what is not being said. The tension in someone's posture, the subtle shift in tone, the hidden frustration behind a smile, all of it becomes instantly clear to you. You learn to interpret others with precision, but in doing so, you slowly drift away from yourself. You become fluent in everyone else's emotions while your own inner voice grows quieter and harder to hear. At first, this sensitivity feels meaningful. It gives you a sense of connection, of being needed, of understanding people on a deeper level, but over time it becomes something heavier. You begin carrying emotional weight that was never yours to hold. What once felt like a gift gradually turns into constant overload. You start realizing that not every emotional atmosphere you enter is something you are meant to absorb or fix. A shift begins when you recognize that real connection should not leave you feeling drained or emotionally burdened. You stop confusing intensity and chaos with depth. You begin to see that true emotional bonds are not defined by how much turbulence you can endure, but by how much peace exists between two people. Genuine connection feels steady, not chaotic. It brings clarity, not confusion. This marks the beginning of a deeper internal transition from simply surviving emotional environments to learning how to navigate them with awareness. In the past, your reactions were almost automatic. If someone around you was upset, you absorbed it. If someone was angry, you carried it. If someone was struggling, you immediately tried to stabilize them. In that state, you were not fully living your own experience. You were constantly managing the emotional state of others. As this awareness grows, you do not become distant or unfeeling. Instead, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were previously neglected. It becomes less about fixing others and more about returning to your own center. You start to recover the energy you once spent replaying conversations, over-analyzing your behavior, or questioning whether you did enough for others. Slowly, you begin to understand that your sensitivity was never meant to function as an emotional sponge. It is more like a refined instrument for perception and discernment, not a tool for absorbing everything around you. To truly understand this exhaustion, you have to look at what has been happening beneath the surface. What you once labeled as kindness is often rooted in a constant state of alertness. When your awareness is always scanning for changes in others' emotions, your nervous system rarely gets a chance to settle. It remains in a heightened state, as if something must always be monitored or managed. Over time, your brain begins to associate emotional stability in others with your own sense of safety. If everyone around you seems calm, you feel okay. If someone becomes unsettled, your system reacts immediately. This creates a cycle where you are continuously tracking and adjusting to emotional shifts outside of you. It is exhausting because it never stops. There is no true pause, no real recovery period. This pattern often forms early in life, becoming so familiar that it feels like your natural personality. But in reality, it is a learned survival response. And when you live in that mode for too long, your own self-awareness becomes secondary. You know everyone else deeply, but you lose touch with yourself. The turning point comes when you begin to change the question you live by. Instead of automatically asking how you can fix, heal, or support someone else, you pause and turn inward. You begin asking a different question: what is happening inside me right now? This shift may seem small, but it creates an entirely new internal structure. It introduces a boundary where there used to be emotional blending. You start distinguishing between empathy and responsibility. You can understand someone's pain without absorbing it as your duty to resolve. You begin to see that constant emotional self-sacrifice is not a sign of love or strength. It is a form of self-neglect disguised as care. Love does not require you to abandon yourself repeatedly in order to prove its depth. With this realization, your understanding of loyalty also begins to change. You may have once believed that staying through emotional chaos, tolerating inconsistency, or enduring mistreatment was a reflection of your strength. You might have thought that remaining present no matter how difficult things became was a form of devotion. But over time, a clearer truth emerges. Remaining in environments that continuously drain or damage you is not resilience. It is erosion. Real emotional maturity is not about how much discomfort you can withstand. It is about how well you can protect your inner stability. If your loyalty requires you to continuously ignore your own needs, then it is no longer loyalty, it is self-abandonment. You begin to notice when relationships are one-sided. You are always listening, always understanding, always supporting, but rarely receiving the same in return. What once felt like being dependable now feels like being emotionally overused. You start to recognize that generosity without balance eventually leads to depletion. This is where boundaries become essential. At first, the idea of boundaries may feel uncomfortable, even unnatural. You may associate them with rejection or emotional distance. But in truth, boundaries are not barriers designed to shut people out. They are guidelines that protect your internal balance while still allowing connection to exist in a healthy form. A boundary is simply clarity. It is the ability to say, this is where my responsibility ends. It is choosing not to engage when you are overwhelmed, not because you do not care, but because you finally understand your limits. In the beginning, asserting these limits may bring guilt or uncertainty. You may question whether you are being too rigid or distant, but that discomfort is not a warning sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that something within you is realigning. It is the sensation of your inner structure strengthening after years of being overly flexible. It is your nervous system learning that it does not have to remain on constant alert. As this process continues, you begin to understand yourself in a completely different way. You are no longer just the person who absorbs, adjusts, and accommodates everyone else. You are someone who can choose where your energy goes. You are someone who can recognize when connection is mutual and when it is draining. And slowly life stops feeling like an emotional battlefield. It starts feeling more grounded, more intentional, and more aligned with who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. Asserting your needs is one of the most important foundations of a healthy self-concept. In the past, you may have believed that being constantly available, flexible, and easy to deal with made you more likable. Somewhere along the way, you equated lack of needs with being lovable. But over time, you start to see how misleading that belief really was. When you have no boundaries, you don't attract balance, you attract imbalance. You draw in people who benefit from your lack of limits, while the ones who genuinely respect emotional reciprocity often keep their distance because they sense there is no structure in how you treat yourself. In a sense, boundaries become a filter. They quietly reveal who can respect your space and who only valued your presence for what they could take from it. Each time you begin setting limits, you are essentially gathering information. You observe reactions without needing to argue or explain. Some people adjust naturally, and others respond with guilt, pressure, or manipulation. That response itself becomes clarity. It shows you who belongs in your inner world and who was only ever comfortable when you were overextending yourself. In this stage of awareness, love is no longer confused with self-erasure. You stop believing that enduring emotional exhaustion is proof of depth or loyalty. Instead, you recognize that constantly sacrificing yourself does not reflect how much you care about others. It reflects how little you have been taught to prioritize yourself. Your loyalty becomes more intentional, no longer automatic. It becomes something you offer where there is mutual respect, not something you give just to prove endurance. The fatigue you feel after social interaction or emotionally charged environments is not imaginary. It is not just mental tiredness, it is a full-body response. Your nervous system processes emotional environments almost like physical conditions. When you are around unpredictability, emotional intensity, or chronic negativity, your body reacts as though it is under threat. Stress chemicals begin to circulate. Your heart rate subtly increases. Your muscles tighten without you noticing. Over time, this state of readiness becomes your default. You start living with tension so familiar that you no longer recognize it as tension. This is why your body feels constantly tight, why your jaw clenches without awareness, and why exhaustion lingers even after rest. Your system has been trying to protect you in an environment it perceives as unsafe. What you once dismissed as sensitivity is actually information. Your physical reactions are not random, they are signals. A headache after speaking with a certain person, sudden fatigue after a draining interaction, or a heaviness in your chest when entering certain environments are all forms of communication. Your body is reporting what your mind often tries to rationalize away. Instead of arguing with these signals or trying to override them with logic, you begin to treat them as valid data. Not assumptions, not overreactions, but feedback. Your nervous system is essentially telling you when something costs more energy than it returns. And over time, ignoring that feedback is what leads to emotional burnout. There is a deeper shift that happens when you stop questioning these reactions and start respecting them. You realize that your intuition is not abstract, it is embodied. It speaks through sensation long before it becomes thought. If something consistently makes your body contract, it is already communicating something important, whether or not you are ready to name it. When you begin honoring these signals, you also begin to understand something crucial. You cannot regulate your inner world while continuously exposing yourself to environments that destabilize it. Inner peace is not only a mindset, it is also environmental. If your surroundings are constantly chaotic, your system never gets the chance to settle. This is why you start making decisions that may look simple from the outside but are deeply protective on the inside. Choosing quiet over overstimulation, stepping away from draining conversations, or declining situations that leave you depleted are not acts of avoidance. They are acts of regulation. They are ways of giving your nervous system permission to come down from constant alertness. In solitude, something important happens. The absence of external emotional demands creates space for recovery. Your body begins to slow down. Your breathing deepens. The constant internal scanning for others' moods begins to quiet. This is not withdrawal from life, it is restoration of balance. One of the most transformative stages of this process is when you stop positioning yourself as the emotional stabilizer for everyone around you. For a long time, you may have unconsciously taken on the role of mediator, absorber, or peacemaker. You tried to soften tension, prevent conflict, and manage emotional discomfort in others so that things would remain stable. But over time, you begin to understand that this role comes at a cost. When you constantly regulate others, you deny them the opportunity to confront and process their own patterns. At the same time, you deny yourself the space to exist without responsibility for everyone else's emotional state. When you step back, something interesting happens. At first, there may be discomfort, both yours and theirs. But eventually, space is created. Space for you to breathe, space for others to face what they have avoided. You are no longer absorbing every emotional shockwave that passes through your environment. And in that absence, a different kind of stability begins to form. Peace starts to feel less like something fleeting and more like something structural. It is no longer just the absence of conflict, it becomes the presence of internal safety. It is the feeling of no longer being on standby for everyone else's emotional emergencies. The final layer of this transformation is quiet but deeply powerful. It is the ability to detach from anything that consistently disrupts your stability without needing drama, confrontation, or explanation. In earlier versions of yourself, leaving may have felt like something that required justification or emotional intensity. You may have felt the need to explain yourself repeatedly, hoping that understanding would eventually lead to change. But clarity eventually replaces explanation. You stop trying to convince people to respect boundaries they have already shown you they will ignore. You stop over-explaining your needs to people who benefit from misunderstanding them. Instead of chasing resolution, you begin choosing alignment. At this point, peace becomes something you protect rather than negotiate. You no longer measure relationships by intensity or history, but by emotional consistency. And perhaps most importantly, you stop believing that staying longer in something painful proves strength. One of the most freeing realizations is that you no longer need to justify your decisions to anyone who is not living inside your nervous system. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head, stop crafting perfect explanations, and stop trying to make others understand what they were never willing to respect in the first place. You begin to see that your energy is not infinite, your attention is not obligation, and your presence is not something to be distributed without awareness. And in that understanding, something subtle but profound shifts. You start belonging to yourself again. The awakening doesn't arrive with noise or drama. It comes with a sharp, almost uncomfortable clarity that cuts through the emotional fog you once lived in. You begin to see that some people were never confused about you at all. They were simply invested in keeping you uncertain because your self-doubt made you easier to manage, easier to access, easier to drain. And once that realization lands, something inside you shifts. The urge to explain yourself starts dissolving. You stop trying to translate your intentions for people who have already decided not to understand them. You recognize that your energy is not endless. It is not something you can keep spending without consequence. It is more like a limited reserve, and you can no longer afford to pour it into relationships that are built on imbalance or quiet extraction. So you stop engaging in the cycle. You stop arguing with people who thrive on argument. You stop defending yourself to those who benefit from misrepresenting you. You stop trying to convince anyone of your worth because you finally understand that someone committed to misunderstanding, you will never be persuaded by explanation. At that point, their perception becomes their responsibility, not your burden. What replaces all that effort is something quieter but far more powerful. You withdraw your emotional labor, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in clarity. You begin to act like the guardian of your own inner world. Conversations that used to stretch endlessly now have limits. Calls that revolve around repetition and emotional chaos naturally become shorter. Invitations that feel obligatory instead of genuine are no longer automatically accepted. You are not creating conflict. You are simply no longer overextending yourself to avoid it. And that absence becomes its own form of communication. Without a dramatic announcement or confrontation, your reduced availability sets a boundary more clearly than words ever could. You are no longer feeding patterns that drain you, and in that silence, the dynamic begins to lose its structure. This is not passive withdrawal. It is deliberate protection. You are reclaiming mental space that once belonged to confusion, obligation, and emotional overload, and redirecting it towards stability. Still, this process carries emotion. Letting go rarely feels clean. Even when a connection has been harmful or draining, there is often grief tied to it. You may find yourself mourning not just the person, but the version of them you once hoped for. You might grieve the future you mentally built around what the relationship could have become. And sometimes memories will surface unexpectedly, carrying a sense of nostalgia that feels heavier than logic. But growth is revealed in how you hold that grief. You allow it to exist without letting it dictate your decisions. You let yourself feel the sadness without turning it into a reason to return to what was harming you. You stop confusing emotional withdrawal symptoms with the idea that you made a mistake. Missing someone no longer automatically translates into needing them back. Your calm becomes evidence. Not loud proof, not emotional justification, just steady internal confirmation that you are moving differently now. You no longer rely on anger to reinforce distance. You don't need resentment to maintain boundaries. Your strength is no longer reactive, it is composed, quiet, stable, self-contained. For a long time, your identity may have been shaped around usefulness. You were the one people turned to when things fell apart. The listener at 2 a.m., the emotional stabilizer in every crisis. The person who absorbed tension so others could function. Over time, that role may have become so familiar that you started equating being needed with being loved. But that identity, while meaningful in appearance, slowly became restrictive. It kept you constantly oriented outward, always scanning, always responding, always adjusting. Your own internal world became secondary to everyone else's emotional fluctuations. You were present in every story except your own. The difficult and transformative question eventually emerges. Who are you when no one needs saving? When the noise quiets and there is nothing to fix, nothing to absorb, nothing to stabilize, what remains? At first, that silence can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. Without urgency to respond to, without emotional emergencies to manage, there is a strange emptiness where constant responsibility used to live. But if you stay in that space, something begins to surface that was previously buried under constant external focus. Your own self starts to reappear. Not as a role, not as a function, but as a person. You begin to rediscover interests that have nothing to do with being useful to others. You start to notice thoughts, desires, and ambitions that were never centered around caregiving or emotional labor. You begin to understand that rest is not something you have to earn through depletion. This is where the deeper reconstruction of identity begins. You stop shapeshifting to match the emotional needs of your environment. You stop automatically adjusting yourself to maintain peace at the cost of authenticity. You start recognizing that harmony that requires self-erasure is not harmony at all. It is suppression disguised as balance. Reclaiming yourself means you no longer ask for permission to exist in your own fullness. You begin expressing preferences without immediately filtering them through others' reactions. You stop constantly evaluating how every word will land emotionally on someone else, and instead start asking whether what you are saying actually reflects you. Empathy is still part of you, but it is no longer your entire identity or your only form of connection. You are allowed to be layered, imperfect, inconsistent at times, and still whole. You are allowed to have needs that do not revolve around caring for others. When you step out of the role of constant caretaker, you finally enter the space of being a complete individual. You are no longer a supporting presence in everyone else's narrative. You become the central presence in your own. And as this internal shift stabilizes, your external world begins to reorganize itself. The relationships that depended on imbalance start to fade naturally, not through conflict, but through misalignment. When you stop over-explaining, over-giving, and over-functioning, the dynamics that relied on that excess no longer have structure to stand on. What remains are different kinds of connections. Ones where mutual awareness exists, where emotional responsibility is shared rather than offloaded, where presence is not taken for granted. These relationships feel different because they are not built on extraction but on balance. In these spaces, you are not valued for how much you can endure or absorb. You are valued for who you are without having to constantly prove usefulness. There is room for silence without discomfort, space for honesty without fear of emotional collapse, and connection without constant maintenance. And slowly, you begin to realize something that changes everything. The most valuable thing you bring into the world was never your ability to fix, carry, or absorb others. It was your ability to exist fully without abandoning yourself in the process. In the end, this entire awakening brings you back to something simple but profoundly life-changing: yourself. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can carry for others, and you start recognizing that your presence was never meant to be a constant sacrifice. What once felt like love through endurance transforms into understanding through clarity. You realize that not every connection is meant to be sustained, and not every emotional demand deserves your participation. Some relationships fall away not because you failed them, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself within them. There is no need for loud endings or dramatic closure. The most meaningful change happens quietly, in the way you choose yourself without explanation, in the way you step back without guilt, and in the way you no longer confuse emotional exhaustion with loyalty. You come to understand that peace is not something you earn after surviving chaos. It is something you protect by refusing to stay in it. And in that protection, you stop being available to patterns that drain you and start becoming available to a life that supports you. The conclusion is not separation from others, but reunion with your own inner stability. You are no longer defined by who needs you, but by who you choose to be when nothing is demanding your energy.